Alright, welcome back. This is going to be a very long one and a very important one. And we're going to go through about 8 articles about the NDIS, just going back a month. Okay, starting with this one titled, "Not the NDIS We Fought For. Disability Advocates Fear New Assessment Driven by Cost Cutting." And this is from the 11th of March 2021. 20 advocacy groups are concerned a desire to save money could see an end to the scheme's individualized approach. Top disability advocates say a government plan to introduce independent assessments to the NDIS is aimed at cutting costs and will fundamentally alter the landmark scheme. A coalition of 20 disability advocacy groups and a peak body of service providers have added their voice to a growing opposition to the new policy, which means NDIS applicants will undergo a free but mandatory assessment by a government-contracted allied health professional. Under the current process, applicants submit evidence from experts, including their specialists, but the government argues this has led to inconsistent funding outcomes and that obtaining those reports can be costly for people with disabilities. But in a statement issued on Thursday, now remember this is back in March, the advocacy groups argued the changes would fundamentally alter the individualized and personalized nature of the NDIS. While we all want greater consistency, we are very concerned this increasingly automated process will not adequately consider individual needs and circumstances, the statement said. This is not the NDIS we fought for. The groups, which include People with Disabilities Australia, Australian Federation for Disability Organisations, and Every Australian Counts, will brief MPs about their concerns in a video conference on Thursday. Notably, the advocacy groups also said that based on the information that has been released by the agency, there were concerns that a desire to cut costs is the main motivation for the hurried introduction of these reforms. They also argued the providers who would carry out the assessments would be contracted by the government, creating a conflict of interest. The introduction of mandatory assessments is the biggest change to the NDIS since it began. Despite the scale and cost of the changes, they have not been rigorously tested or undergone an independent evaluation, they said. Consultation has been rushed and the questions and concerns of people with disabilities, their families, and the organisations that support and represent them have not been addressed. The NDIA is currently undertaking a consultation process on the reforms, while the parliamentary committee is also set to examine the changes. However, the government has said its plans to legislate to allow independent assessments will begin mid-2021. Mel Tran, social entrepreneur and NDIS participant, said the scheme had a long way to go, but that independent assessments were not the answer. The NDIS is a fundamental part of the lives of people with disabilities, and it has meant so much to have an individualized approach to each person's complex needs, Tran, a chairperson at Children and Young People with Disability Australia, said. Dougie Hurd, who helped campaign for the NDIS, said the mandatory assessments would put people living with disabilities back in boxes based on an automated process. The NDIS was an idea that became a reality because of bipartisan leadership, he said. People with disabilities are looking for that leadership again. The disability support sector also rounded on the assessments with David Moody, the chief executive for the National Disability Service, also calling for the reforms to be halted. Moody said he was not confident the assessments would allow a complete and accurate understanding of the fundamental abilities of people with invisible or complex disability. The real worry for us is that these results cannot be challenged or appealed easily, he added. In fact, people will not be given a copy of the full assessment report unless they apply to see it, and the hurdles that presents for a person with disability is unacceptable. The NDIS estimate most assessments will last about 3 hours and applicants would be matched to a therapist or clinician that has the right skills, experience and training to complete the assessment. But Don Illigan, an ex-Paralympian who now works with Warra Disability Support Service, said it would be difficult for some to articulate their needs to a stranger in a 3-hour window. At worst, it forces people to play the game of being disabled, he said. Aaron Carpenter, who took part in the assessments pilot, told The Guardian last week he was asked many yes or no questions with little context and was assessed by a physiotherapist despite having autism. Last week, a coalition of 25 other disability organisations, including legal centres that help people navigate the system, also called for the assessment to be scrapped. The NDIS Minister, Stuart Robert, has previously argued the reforms were based on the Productivity Commission's original design for the scheme and were recommendations from the 2019 June review into the NDIS Act. He has argued the changes will make the system fairer and more consistent, and stressed the government is consulting with the disability community about the changes. Robert released new data on Thursday morning showing significant disparities between average plan sizes in different parts of Tasmania. The data shows Clark, which includes Hobart, had an average plan budget of $105,600 compared to Lyons and Franklin, which averaged $70,200 and $68,900 respectively. Similarly, the average plan size for living in Launceston was $86,000 compared to $71,700 for those in other parts of northern Tasmania. Access to the NDIS and a NDIS participants' plan should not be determined by your postcode, and the data released today demonstrates we have a long way to go to deliver a simpler, faster, fairer and more flexible NDIS in Tasmania, Robert said on Thursday. Okay, I'll comment on each article at the end of it. Interesting, he chose Tasmania of all states. Well, you would kind of have to pick one with a smaller population when you do shit like using the averages to try and make a point. Alright, and with all that said, all of that is irrelevant in regards to the NDIS because suggesting that every participant should have the same funding goes against the whole idea of the NDIS. Like it said at the beginning of the article, people love it for its individualized and personalized aspects to its planning. And something else from the beginning of this article, where they're trying to justify this by saying it's costly for people to go get all the evidence and the results and reports from their specialists and the experts. Oh yeah, now I've got a lot to say about this. First of all, face value. Is that costly, is it? Oh well, good thing for stuff like the NDIS. Secondly, if you're a lawmaker and that was a concern, I don't know, maybe put a cap on it. Maybe make it so you can only charge a person $1 to cover the printing costs. But that's if that really was an issue, because they're full of shit. Because other than the fact that many people will just have to see their specialist anyways, but then there are other people like my brother who doesn't really have the need to go see a specialist too often. Because as many of us might know, but the people who seem to be put in charge of the agency don't know, disabilities are quite unique depending on the person, depending on the disability, very different each situation. And so like my brother's on the NDIS, but he doesn't have a need for, let's say, a wheelchair, a motorized wheelchair. They're pretty costly. And some people that use them might need a new one year and might not the next. Maybe they just want to upgrade just because there's a new one that they can get. And I'm just describing this hypothetical situation of someone who you'd see and not question why they'd be on the NDIS, to give you a rough idea as to why they might have fluctuating funding requirements. And you know what? That's where I want my taxpayer dollars going. If it's gonna help out someone get a new wheelchair, even if they just feel like getting a new wheelchair, you're a prick if you have a problem with that, honestly. Now let's move on to the next article. Flawed, unethical, and dangerous. The new NDIS assessment risks traumatizing the vulnerable. Results of the independent assessment pilot scheme have raised grave concerns for people with disability, advocates say, and this is from the 10th of April 2021. Peter Lambert is one of the few Australians who can speak from experience about what some say will be the biggest change to the National Disability Insurance Scheme since it was introduced. As part of a controversial plan, the government says it will make it fairer. NDIS participants will no longer submit reports from their treating specialist to gain access to the landmark scheme. Instead, they will undertake a mandatory interview of about 3 hours with an outsourced government contracted allied health professional. I think it's a rotten idea, Lambert, 46, says. The NDIA should bugger off and leave people with disabilities with enough money to be able to live an ordinary life like everyone else in Australia. Lambert, who took part in a independent assessment pilot scheme with her mother, Laurel lives with cerebral palsy, an intellectual disability, a hearing impairment, and epilepsy. By speaking out in The Guardian this week, back in April, the Lambert family joins a growing list of critics of the plan that includes a united disability sector, Labour, the Greens, a past NDIS executive, and several state governments. The new mandatory but free assessment will begin in the middle of the year and will apply to new applicants and later the 440,000 participants already on the scheme. The National Disability Insurance Agency insists they are aimed at addressing consistency issues and inequality within the scheme, not cutting costs or reducing package sizes. But like many critics, Peter Lambert is not convinced. I think they're doing this so they can take money away from people with disabilities and use it for something else, she says in a video interview for advocacy organisation Every Australian Counts, obtained by Guardian Australia. I think it's to change the way they operate so it doesn't cost the government as much money. And while the NDIA claims feedback from the pilot has been positive, Laurel Lambert argues the questionnaires, known as the assessment tools, are too blunt to provide an accurate picture of Peter's needs. Laurel Lambert reels off some of the questions. Do you get along with your mum? Peter just said yes. Can you go up some stairs? Can you concentrate for 10 minutes? God knows I can't sometimes. As soon as Peter would respond, the assessor would punch a button on the computer. Lambert adds, there was no response or asking for any detail. The problem, according to disability groups who have been sounding the alarm for months about the new policy, is the answers to these questions can be more complicated than a yes or no. Laurel Lambert points to another example. Can you catch a bus? Well, what bus? There are a lot of people that are trained to catch one bus only. Lots of people with intellectual disabilities, for instance, said. The National Disability Insurance Agency has suggested the free assessment will save participants the cost of seeking medical reports and therefore reduce inequality and inconsistency in the system. It says participants will spend less time discussing specific supports with the agency and more time on how to best implement their plan. The NDIA revealed over 100 tools and spoke with academics, allied health professionals, and with the disability community to select disability-neutral tools that focus on understanding a person's functional capacity, it says. The former NDIS Minister, Stuart Roberts, has also argued the assessment was recommended in a review of the NDIS Act constructed by former Finance Department Chief David Tune in 2018. But this week, serious questions were raised about that report. Documents released under Freedom of Information obtained by Labour and first reported by 9 newspapers this week appears to show a section of the report recommending introduction of the assessments was inserted by a public servant. Labour's NDIS spokesperson Bill Shorten, who has been vigorously campaigning against the policy, says it shows the report was a sham, a claim rejected by the office of the new NDIS Minister, Linda Reynolds. The government is pushing ahead with the plan despite the fact that a parliamentary inquiry is still examining the policy. The submissions to the inquiry, many of which were published this week, reveal widespread community concern. Domestic Violence Victoria, for example, warns victim survivors dealing with trauma may be unable to communicate their needs in a single session and be disempowered by this approach. The submissions also warns being assessed by a stranger and having to retell their story can be re-traumatizing. In an explosive submission, Marie Johnson, the former head of the NDIS Technology Authority, argues the independent assessment plan was utterly flawed, unethical, and a dangerous concept on every level. Johnson also suggests text messages sent to some participants asking them to take part in the pilot were unethical and represented scam-like tactics. The messages, which referred to an exclusive invitation, were effectively luring people into participating, Johnson says. In a change announced in February, participants now get $150 in exchange for taking part in the pilot. The NDIA rejected Johnson's claims in a statement to Innovation Australia, which first reported her comments this week. The agency says the pilot was voluntary and those taking part could withdraw at any point. Laurel Lambert says she was aware of another person with disabilities who has been pestered by the agency to take part in the pilot. She has been bombarded with them asking her to go and do it, Lambert says. The woman has an anxiety issue and it has got her in such a state that she has now asked me to go tell them, no, please don't ask her again. The parliamentary inquiry expected to hold hearings this month where a wide array of critics will possibly give evidence. In her submission, Colleen Pearce, Victoria's public advocate, has told MPs the assessments are a serious threat to the original intention and proper functioning of the NDIS and could particularly impact on people with cognitive impairment. The Australian Physiotherapy Association and the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists have also lined up against the proposal, while the Aboriginal Health Council of South Australia believes the assessments will see Indigenous communities further disengage with the NDIS. Some who have taken part in the pilot talk of mismatches between the assessors and the participants. Laurel Lambert, for example, says her daughter's assessor was a speech pathologist. Aaron Carpenter, who lives with autism and spoke to The Guardian last month, was assessed by a physiotherapist. The agency says participants will be matched to a therapist or clinician that has the right skills, experience and training to complete the assessment. All assessors will be qualified to administer the assessment tools, it says. Peter Lambert, who lives in her own home with another person with disability, is still worried. She says none of the questions helped her to feel like I am working hard to be an independent woman. Nothing was positive, she said. None of it will show them what I need to help me be who I want to be. Okay, 2 points I want to make about this article is how Stuart Roberts keeps mentioning it was part of a plan before. Yeah, well, if it wasn't included, that was probably for a reason, mate. They probably left it out because it was trash. And the second point I wanted to make about this article was that's a hell of a list of people that oppose it. That's a hell of a list, and they're still pushing for it. NDIS cost-cutting task force told to reduce growth in participants and spending. National Disability Insurance Agency quietly forms unit to avoid cost overrun in 2021-22. And this is from the 13th of April 2021. The agency that runs the National Disability Insurance Scheme has quietly established a new task force aimed at cutting growth in funding packages and participant numbers. Guardian Australia has obtained internal documents published below that show the National Disability Insurance Agency has created a new unit to make short-term immediate changes to the scheme, citing a forecast cost overrun in 2021-22. The actions of the Sustainability Action Task Force will make immediate changes to slow growth in participant numbers, slow growth in spending per participant and strengthen operational discipline. In accordance with the requirements of the NDIS Act and rules, the 3-page document marked sensitive says. The establishment of the new unit aimed at slowing spending growth comes amid an already fierce fight between the government and disability groups over a planned overhaul of the NDIS Act and a controversial introduction of independent assessments, both of which are viewed by advocates as an attempt to gut the scheme. The document claims the new task force is a separate to the scheme reform incentives, such as moves to overhaul the NDIS Act and introductions of independent assessments. But it appears to have consolidated increasingly alarmist warnings buried inside the NDIA's corporate plan about the NDIS spending and will fuel concerns among the disability community about the agency's plans. Martin Hoffman, the NDIA's chief executive, announced the establishment of the task force in an internal staff update last month, saying he had appointed former McKenzie associate partner and existing NDIA general manager to lead the unit. While Hoffman's all-staff update refers to a need to moderate growth in spending in the next 6 months, it's not as explicit about the claimed need to slow growth in spending per participant. The internal document was designed for frontline planning staff and strictly not for external distribution. Dated April 2021, it outlines several principles that should be applied every time a staff creates a participant's plan, and notes that these will help ensure the scheme is financially sustainable. Notably, the first principle is fair for everyone both today and for future generations. Others include fair funding to pursue your goals, evidence-based best practices, and fair support for your disability needs. The document includes talking points for staff, which include, at the moment the costs of the scheme are increasing at a much higher rate than expected because we have been building budgets based on inconsistent information and decision making. Labour's NDIS spokesperson Bill Shorten said the leaked secret plan showed the Morrison government is acting directly against the interest of Australians with disabilities. It is a disgrace that they are instructing government staff to deliberately slow down getting people on the NDIS and reduce their funding, he said. This is just the latest leak of a broader plan against the NDIS and participants that the government is hiding in the shadows because even they know it is shameful. Catherine McAlpine, Chief Executive of Inclusion Australia, said the organisation was greatly concerned that the model of short-term cost-cutting will not make the investments needed for the social and economic participation of people with intellectual disabilities. It's a false economy to penny pinch when it is an investment that will keep costs down in the long term. The NDIS has told us for months that the proposed changes to the scheme are about fairness and consistency. The disability sector has expressed consistent concern that the real issue is cost cutting. It seems that our concerns have been justified. The NDIA document says that the total budget for the participant and scheme expenditure grew at 23% on average between 2019-20 and 2020-21 financial years. This is almost 6 times the capped 4% per annum rate, the document says. The Sustainability Action Task Force, SAT, has been set up to identify and deliver the immediate actions we need to take to avoid this forecast overrun for 2021-22 financial year. The NDIA's corporate plan has previously identified supported independent living, where participants receive around-the-clock support to live in shared accommodation as a driver of the growth in spending. But the plan noted the agency would still target both SIL and non-SIL services in reform to drive better outcomes for participants while ensuring financial sustainability. Advocates have argued that one of the reasons for growth in spending is that participants are increasingly being empowered to utilize their plans. They say the scheme was never intended to place a cap on supports and have repeatedly criticized the agency's focus on sustainability. The NDIA's last annual report, meanwhile, noted that there have been continued to be more children approaching the scheme than expected. There are about 430,000 participants in the scheme, a figure expected to increase to 532,000 participants by the 30th of June 2023. The 2019 budget revealed a $1.6 billion underspend in the NDIS, which prompted an unlikely joint statement from the New South Wales Coalition and Victorian Labor governments, accusing the government of shortchanging people with disabilities. A spokesperson for the NDIS, Minister Linda Reynolds, says the minister was committed to working collaboratively with states and territories and the sector to ensure the NDIS achieves the coverage intended and supports quality outcomes for all NDIS participants in a way that is fair, equitable, consistent and affordable. The government also acknowledges it is responsible to ensure the participants continue to receive the reasonable and necessary supports they need, and to ensure a long-term financial endurance of the scheme, they said. She is currently receiving comprehensive briefings and is consulting with all states and territories, disability ministers, and disability sector and NDIS participants. A spokesperson for the NDIA said funding for the NDIS continued to grow, with the original budget allocation for 2021-22 increasing from $21.7 billion to $23.8 billion. That said, the agency is bound by the NDIS Act and that means we need to ensure we stay within our allocated budget consistent with the agreement between the Commonwealth and the state and territories. So we need to assess the support we provide through a sustainability lens as well, the spokesperson said. To ensure we abide by our obligations to follow the Act, the agency set up an internal team to identify, design and deliver the actions we need to take to improve how we operate the scheme and to make sure the NDIS is sustainable. The team's early focus has been developing clearer information about creating and using NDIS plans, including enhancing the principles we follow to create NDIS plans, which are founded on the existing information in the NDIS Act rules, which instruct the CEO and agency to establish operating guidelines to ensure appropriate operation of the scheme. Okay, here's that document from that article. I won't read it to you because all the important bits were already mentioned in the article. It's just a whole bunch of corporate word salad, pretty much saying stick it to people with disabilities, really. Few points I want to make about this article, other than now they changed from Stuart Robert to Linda Reynolds, Minister of NDIS. Woo. It gets worse from here, guys. It really does. And I want to quickly go back to how Catherine McAlpine mentioned that investing in it now will prevent costs down the road, and that resonated with me. I've made videos that touch on this before about how if we don't have the right institutions to take care of people and their different needs, it's just going to fall on other services that are provided, because not spending the money to look after everyone in the community now will just end up costing you more later because of the cost that comes with people being homeless, for example, or people taking up room in the emergency room, or people being locked up by the police. So it affects many sectors from health to law enforcement, so you're better off just looking after people from the get-go. And finally, gotta love how they just gaslit everybody that was concerned, spent so long saying, nah, it's not about cutting costs, and then boom, you get this whole, we gotta look at it through a sustainability lens. Blah. These guys are monsters. Alright, moving on to the next article. NDIA hires research company to sell controversial changes to staff and public, leaks reveal. Exclusive leaked documents show staff struggling and frustrated, fearing they will not be able to adequately support participants. And this is from the 17th of April 2021. The agency that runs the National Disability Insurance Scheme hired an external research company to help create a new narrative aimed at selling controversial changes to its staff and the public, leaked documents show. A staff memo that summarizes the findings of the research obtained by The Guardian also reveals NDIS staff are struggling and feel they cannot adequately support participants through the rapid and sweeping overhaul of the scheme. The government is facing widespread backlash from disability groups, and this week the new Minister Linda Reynolds placed one of the most contentious changes, independent assessments, on hold. But the overhaul, which includes a rewrite of the NDIS Act that determines who is eligible for the scheme and what can be funded, as well as technical changes to how funding packages are created, also appears to have frustrated staff within the agency. The internal research found staff were struggling with the amount of information and do not feel that they can adequately support participants through the changes, while inconsistency of messages delivery is affecting participant, staff and partner trust. Other findings from the focus group research with participants, staff and partners included that the agency needs to provide more transparency on wrongdoings, that it needed to reduce corporate speak and vague language because both lead to the assumption that things are being hidden, that it needed to speak about sustainability of the scheme because even if the outcome is not liked, transparency is important. Sustainability can come across as threatening. Detail is needed about why sustainability is an issue and that participants are not at fault and the responsibility the agency takes for this, the research found according to the staff's memo from late March. That finding comes as a separate leaked documents this week revealed the agency had set up a secretive unit, the Sustainability Action Task Force, to slow the growth in participants and funding packages. Disability groups claimed that establishing the task force showed their fears that the agency wanted to cut costs within the scheme had been justified. The document shows the external research company's work had been used to create a new narrative for staff, including including a slogan and logo to promote the changes, a better NDIS. To ensure staff and partners feel confident and supported in delivering reformed messages, a better NDIS narrative, our story, has been developed, a leaked staff presentation said. This narrative is aimed at selling the changes to the public, while the new logo, created in-house by the agency and described in minute detail in the presentation, is considered internal branding. The look and feel of the new narrative includes a coloured journey line that weaves through the design, it said. Our research revealed participants appreciated transparency and acknowledgement that the past has not been without its challenges. The journey line represents this by portraying the twists and turns and bumps along the NDIS journey. The journey line always ended up in an upward trajectory, reinforcing the positive forward progression resulting in a better NDIS. Staff are told in the presentation to insert some key phrases organically into their communications with participants and stakeholders, as well as presentations and reports. These include slogans such as a better NDIS, an NDIS that works for everyone, and together let's build an NDIS to ensure the scheme will be there for you and Australians if they need it over their lifetime. It should not be labelled as a narrative when it is used. Please refer to it as our story, the presentation said. Talking points explaining the agency's strategy for the future included slowing down the unsustainable growth of the scheme, but it is stressed that this doesn't mean cutting costs. As a Commonwealth corporate entity, the National Disability Insurance Agency is exempt from updating new contracts on the Oz tender website, and the agency refused to answer questions about the cost of the research. Bill Shorten, Labor's NDIS spokesperson, told Guardian Australia the material would be a joke were it not true. People with disabilities don't need a coloured journey line or other taxpayer-funded marketing dribble, he said. If Minister Reynolds was serious about a better NDIS, she should deliver it, cancel the mandatory assessments and call off the Razor Gang. People with disabilities and their carers will be furious that this is where funding is going when they are battling to make ends meet. Jordan Steele-John, the Greens disability spokesman, said this document made it clear that the government still do not get it. He said it was typical of the government's patronising approach. They need to stop spinning and start listening to disabled people and their concerns we have about these changes, he said. The new narrative documents are the latest in a string of leaks emanating from the agency after the disclosure of a draft legislation, as well as documents this week revealing the creation of the so-called Razor Gang. The external research company findings also claim that the agency needed to explain the concept of insurance but as a safety net for all Australians rather than using the traditional connotations of insurance. An NDIA spokesperson said conducting research was not unusual for government agencies and seeking feedback and input from participants is not new to the NDIA. This happens in a number of ways, including online and email feedback, one-on-one or small group discussions, and participants working directly with project teams to design product or policy, including through the agency's Participant First initiative. To supplement internal research efforts, the agency used an external agency with unique skills in communication, insight, and to conduct research. The agency is committed to seeking feedback on reform proposals through a continued and comprehensive consultation program. Now, I just want to say that all these documents being leaked about all these different things show me that the people working for the agency, or some people, were really disturbed by what's going on and needed other people to see what their intentions were. So shout out to anyone that did that. And I just want to make a quick point about how Linda Reynolds' big achievement as the minister is updating the logo or some shit, and they decide to put a line going upwards for an agency where they've got disability in the name, and you're gonna put a little squiggly line that reminds everyone that everything's gonna be uphill from here on out when it comes to the NDIS. Good move, Linda. Alright, I realise it's probably best if I do this in two parts, so we'll do a quick summary and then I'm going to show you a news report. So it went from, we're going to change it to independent assessments to save you guys money somehow. And these changes are so the NDIS is more equal and fair, which kind of goes against the original idea. And then it eventually came out that, it is about quote-unquote financial sustainability, but they still have the resources to get agencies to come up with how they're going to sell this to everybody. And all of this just to be able to kick more people off the NDIS, it's disgusting. And to add to all of it, just the fact that if they really were concerned about saving money, you could probably do something
Behind
about
these doors,
this.
police say are the ringleaders of a scam.
Go!
Targeting our most vulnerable. Mohammed Salam, his wife Noor Ubaida, brother Muath Salam were arrested during coordinated raids across Western Sydney. Police say they set up 3 NDIS service providers that allowed them to fraudulently claim up to $10 million from a government scheme to assist those living with a disability. That money was allegedly used to purchase luxury cars and even gold nuggets.
Anyone who rips off the disabled deserves a giant judicial kick in the backside, and they need to, be made to repay the money, and they need to go to jail.
The government has welcomed the breakthrough. The arrest of 6 people in relation to alleged fraud against the NDIS shows the Morrison government's commitment to protecting the scheme. But the same thing happened 2 years ago. Also in Western Sydney, more than $1 million was siphoned from the NDIS. The opposition wants the government to do more.
Rather than look at where the money's being taken out the back door of the scheme by the crooks and the cheats, instead they just lock up the front door to stop any deserving people being able to access the scheme.